All righty, we are 1 minute past the hour, so we're going to go ahead and dive in. In a second, I'll give an intro for myself and for my colleague Chris here, but I wanted to start out because I think we've been having a lot of internal discussions recently within our company, within Vital Interaction, and one of the primary things that constantly is coming up over and over again as we've been talking to customers is this idea of, man, like we don't have enough staff to, like, everyone's short staffed right now. There's not enough time in the day to handle the tasks that are needed to be done at practices, and that's happening all over the United States. And so this will be hopefully a small piece of the puzzle in what we've been trying to do to help mitigate some of the tasks that are having to be done every day at healthcare practices, again, across the US. So the topic today is recover your lost patients. And I'll give a brief intro on myself. My name is Joey Wickham. I am the senior account manager here at Vital Interaction. I've had the privilege of working with hundreds of different customers across different specialties, across all portions of the United States, and really working towards problem solving on different areas. This has been one of our biggest focuses over the last few years, is the focus on patients who are slipping through the cracks, recovering those patients, getting them back in. And a lot of that work has been done with Chris as well. So I'll let you give a quick intro, Chris, and then we can dive in.
Yeah, thanks, Joey. My name is Chris Gowell. I've been at Vital now for 6 years. Had the pleasure of working with Joey for 3 of those. And yeah, it's been great to work on the case studies that we're going to go over today. I've had the benefit of working from the support team, and now I'm the product manager. And it's been really fun to work with Joey and our customers to look at some of the ways that we can help practices through automation, or if it's just helping practices with their workflows as well. So it's been a long time coming to do this webinar, Joey.
Yeah, I think I can speak for both of us when I say, like, most, if not everything of what we're going to cover in the webinar today is stuff that's been prompted from the healthcare practices that we work with. Being able to have conversations with practice managers, with, everyday staff that's working with patients, figuring out, hey, what are the most time-consuming tasks for you? How can we help in those? So a lot of this has been driven directly from healthcare practices, and so hopefully it will be beneficial for other practices as we go here.
Absolutely.
All right, learning objectives. So we divided this into 3 different sections that will hopefully be a cohesive, as we go here, it'll tie together well. The first thing is just the identifying portion. So figuring out, why are patients, slipping through the cracks? Why are you losing patients? What are the original pieces that are making that happen? And so we'll go over several instances. I've got like a little story that I put together of how that might happen. The second piece is, okay, after those patients have gone missing, what are the options for trying to get those patients back in? Seeing what Chris and I saw a lot of practices doing before, what we've seen more now, especially as technology evolves. And then the last thing is, Chris especially has worked on case studies with different practices to figure out what works well, why it works, and why it works even within different specialties as well. Again, working with different specialties, we've learned a lot, whether that's from eye groups, from dermatology. Seeing what works well in different specialty has been very interesting, and so we'll go over the success and the case studies within that. So first piece, identify ways your practice is losing patients. So I want to, again, I have like this kind of silly little short story, but I think it will help us to visualize in the first place, why does this happen? So the story is about, I named him Jerry. So this is Jerry. And Jerry, we're going to say, has an eye doctor appointment coming up, right? So he has his eye doctor appointment, usually has it once a year. He never misses his eye doctor appointment. He's always going to make sure that he's there on time. He's going to let them know if he's not going to come. But it just so happens that right at the last second, he had an emergency come up and he had to go after that. And unfortunately, he forgot about his eye doctor appointment because of the emergency that was happening. And so what happens is Jerry goes after the emergency. He doesn't let them know. And then what happens on the staff side is they have 1,000 things going on, right? I'm sure you can relate to this as a healthcare practice. I mean, you've got to be answering the phones, you've got to be helping patients that are in the office. There's so many things that are involved on a day-to-day basis, even from the doctors needing you to do things that unfortunately they weren't able to reach out to Jerry because there were a lot of other tasks that were happening in the day. So Jerry forgot about it because he had his emergency come up on the side. The practice wasn't able to reach out to them, reach out to Jerry in in a short amount of time. And so that is our premise of a lost patient. That's how a patient might initially become lost in the first place. So if we go to the next slide, we have just like a few examples of how this might happen. So Jerry would be the first example here, right? It would be a missed appointment. So he had an appointment scheduled, then he missed his appointment and he forgot to reschedule. And so that's our first example. A patient, and we'll use the terminology maybe interchangeably here, but like a patient who slipped through the cracks, a lost patient. The second example there, no follow-up appointments, might be a little different. It might be more, maybe Jerry showed up for an appointment, but then he got out the door before you scheduled a follow-up or put a recall into the system to get him back in. So that might be another reason that a patient might slip through the crack, or just didn't pay attention to, a recall when they got it. And so that's how they slipped through. The other two there, probably Chris can speak more educatedly than I around some of what we've seen there as far as patients slipping through the cracks. I'll let you take that one, Chris.
Yeah, and I think, just to reiterate on what you said, there's one thing to not have a follow-up appointment and making sure, for example, you get the annual eye check. But I think what we're learning from a lot of our customers now, especially in eye care ophthalmology, is care protocol. Is what if a patient was diagnosed with a certain condition such as diabetic retinopathy? That's what we mean by care protocol. How often do patients' eyes need to be checked, for example? So I think some examples here is looking at patients that had a certain diagnosis or CPT code, say 1 year ago, and say, right, this patient had a cataract appointment or cataract evaluation, and maybe that patient needs cataract surgery. Let's make sure that we at least reach out to those patients to let them know to be scheduled for an appointment or an evaluation. And I think that falls into being engaged in healthcare too. Just certain campaigns that can be run to let patients know that you're thinking about them, that you're an open practice and it's important to be seen. And I think that's where personalization comes in as well. Mm-hmm. But what we're really learning with the better integrations that we have is tracking certain diagnosis, CPT and ICD codes for whatever condition it might be, and trusting in us really to make sure that patients are being followed up with. And I think, and we'll talk about this a few times where I don't think automation is the key or answer to everything, but I think what is really important is matching or complementing the automation piece with the manual piece as well, because at the end of the day, there's nothing better than a face-to-face visit, but having that automation in piece and tracking patients that should be seen on a timely basis is becoming paramount for a lot of practices, especially as it relates to MIPS and macro measures and things like that.
Yeah. And I think, as you may be looking at these you may have an idea for your practice of like, oh, it's definitely, it's definitely patients not having follow-up appointments, or it's definitely people who are missing their appointments that aren't coming back in. That's why patients are slipping through the cracks at our practice. It may be that you have no idea. Everyone, as Chris and I have worked with lots of different practices, it seems every practice is a little different in terms of their patient base, what will help to get their patients back in versus, for example, like an example that I give all the time is like practices that are in the deep South have to treat interact with their patients oftentimes differently than maybe our practices that are in the Northeast, just because it's a different lifestyle, even in the different parts of the United States. So understanding your patient base, which in a lot of ways you're going to know best, and then taking what you know best into best practices of automation. And as Chris said, knowing the balance between automation and manual outreach and the face-to-face there as well.
Yeah, it can be just very time consuming, tracking patients. As I mentioned, we work with a lot of practices that are kind of overwhelmed and stressed out about, oh, we have to, we had 10 missed appointments yesterday, we have to call those patients. And I think that's just taken away from the healthcare of the patient too, by having to do that.
And then it piles up, and it's like the next day it's 15 and they weren't able to reach the 10. And then pretty soon it's an unmanageable list that, I mean, nobody would expect to be able to handle. So we have a quick survey or poll, whatever you want to call it here. But it's around how you are currently tracking patients. So I'm going to go ahead and launch this poll. And so you will have a chance, you should get a pop-up on your screen right now to select what way you are currently tracking missed appointments. So some of the options there, are you just doing it on a pen and paper, you're, writing down when there's a patient that was missed? Maybe there are reports that you can run within your practice management system that are going to allow you to find those patients. Some people have it more like, within technology on a spreadsheet, but not within their system. I have literally talked to some people who they must have steel trap brains, and they just keep the list in their head and they know who the patients are that they need to reach out to. And a lot of people are, don't have time to track it either. So yeah, I don't know if you have anything else to add to that, Chris. We'll give another 20 seconds or so here for people to complete the poll.
Yeah, I'm excited to see the results here.
Yeah, we've done this once before. Just to like get a poll out to see how people track, and I think it's interesting to see the trend. There's definitely a trend here. I'll share it in a second. I don't know if everyone else can see it as well as we go here, but all right, I'll give five more seconds until we end the poll. Get your votes in now. And all right, we'll end the poll there. All right, so it seems like we have a clear winner. And this goes right along with most of what we've seen with practices that we work with. Number one winner by far, we run reports in our patient management system. So there are oftentimes reports within practice management systems, other systems out there, that you're going to be able to see which patients haven't come in, whether that's looking at statuses like no-show status or those kinds of things, seeing patients that haven't been in a while. Oftentimes, a manual process to actually reach out to the patients, but at least you can track it. And I would say as well, the second most popular is also we don't track this. It's just, as Chris and I were talking about, there's just not time in the day. Oftentimes there's so many other tasks that have to be juggled in terms of reaching out to patients, and the busy work at the office, talking to patients once they're in the office, doing work for the providers at the practice. But yeah, I mean, I would say, Chris, this pretty well aligns with what we've seen with the practices we work with.
Yeah, it does, honestly. And I think a lot of practice management systems have great reporting, and we pretty much piggyback off those reporting to put those reports in our system, which we can, and then sort of look at the data and how do we manage that data and outreach to patients. So I'm excited to go on to the next pieces of the case studies as well, to see how we can help and look at those reports as well.
Yeah, for sure. So I guess staying in the same vein here. So the second piece of what we're doing is recognizing how reactivations can re-engage your patients. So I think it's important to take a step back here and understand what even is the definition of what a reactivation is, because something that I've realized in my years working in healthcare now is it seems everyone has different terminology for what they're talking about. And so it's important to make sure that we're on the same page. So the sum total of how I understand a reactivation, and as we talk about them here at Vital Interaction, a reactivation is basically anything that you are doing to try and get a patient back in who maybe normally would not be coming back in. So I think, I mean, again, Chris, you're probably more of an expert on this. You have more experience in the field, but what would you say we have seen, like, I guess, pre-existing before we've gotten involved? What have you seen practices doing in terms of like reactivating patients? And then I guess you can probably just branch that into what we've been doing through smart retention and all that.
Yeah, I mean, as the poll suggests, running reports in the system and calling patients, sometimes triggering letters to the patients as well. So that's a very time-consuming and expensive process. And I think there's nothing wrong with that as well, as I mentioned, the personal touch. But I think what we're learning is how do we take that time off administrators' hands, people working, calling patients as well. But yeah, it can be a very daunting, intimidating process. And I think that that segues into what we call the smart list engine. So you imagine your practice management system. What we aim at VI is to sort of mirror that data and put it into our portal. And what we use is a smart list engine. And then essentially what it is, it's a way to add and subtract certain criteria of patients. So if you see here on the build section, what we can look at, so this would be for a typical annual reactivation, but you can imagine all kinds of use cases. So here what we see is, let's look at all patients that have had an appointment in the past year to a year and a half that had kept appointments. So that's our first list. And then you can drill down into say, let's look at patients that had a diagnosis code or a CPT code billed in the last year to a year and a half. And that's a very powerful list in itself. But now what we want to do is subtract any patients from the first list in the second that have been seen since or have a future appointment. So now what you have is a pure list of patients that meet that criteria, and that criteria would then run on an automated basis. So let's assume you have your first list of all patients that have not had an annual exam in 1 year. Now let's make sure that that list reruns every day. So now you have a fresh list of patients every day. And then we can set up the communication piece to it as well. So assuming that those lists of patients load into Vital Interaction, for example, now let's set up the cadence and the notification preference of if it's email, text, or voice. And then I think what sort of the icing on the cake is what we like to call is a health check. Let's look at that results. Let's see how many patients were messaged, how many of those patients scheduled an appointment, how many patients need to be followed up with. So it's almost sort of that peace of mind to making sure that you are following up on subsets of patients that really need to be seen, or is it just a blanket, let's make sure every patient get a message if they haven't been seen in a year. Same principle applies to no-show or cancelled appointments as well. But I think the key there is the adding and subtracting of lists and automating that list to make sure that patients are refreshed as well. And I'm sure you've seen plenty of examples yourself, Joey.
Yeah, well, and that's what I was gonna say. I would say one of the most powerful things I would say, I mean, there's lots of powerful things about doing lists like this, but the addition and subtraction method, because constantly as I'm talking to practices, one of the things, and actually we just did a webinar on something similar around like what patients truly want in terms of communication. And something that a lot of practices are dealing with is like they're trying to automate stuff, but then at the same time, patients don't like being bombarded by a bunch of automated messages coming from, a robot, right? So it's like, how do you balance that out? And so I think this is the key, one of the biggest keys of the way that these lists are run is not only adding the patients that we need.
We lost Joey there.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah, yes, I can now.
Okay, I must have dropped for a second. But one of the biggest things is the addition and subtraction part of the list, right? Where it's not only are we building a list of patients that we need to reach out to, but we're also making sure that we subtract the patients that we don't want to reach out to, so that we're not bombarding a bunch of patients who don't want to get a message from the practice, right? So that's, I would say over and over again, as I talk to practices, that's one of the biggest pieces of it. But then of course, the second piece is automating the messages, because it's one thing to build a list, but it's another thing to actually not have to call all those patients, because so often now patients don't answer the phone. So you can call them all you want and you can leave a voicemail and hopefully it will be effective. But it's really important to understand that, like, hey, we don't even have to do the outreach on this. It's happening automatically. And then tracking the success. So it's, the full scope of it to understand, hey, how are we reactivating? What is the method that we're doing that? And is it actually effective or not? Because then, as the last piece there, the health check, is it actually working? Are we actually able to get these patients in that haven't come back in? Who are our patients that aren't coming back in? Is there a trend there? Is it this kind of a patient that's not coming back in? Is it patients that had this appointment type that's not oftentimes coming back in? And I think that can help the practice to make decisions moving forward from there, which is, again, part of that health check.
Absolutely.
So we have another poll. So I will share the poll here. Let me put it in the poll. All right. So this one, just launched it. So as a practice, what is your top priority? This will probably be kind of difficult. But the idea behind it is, if you had to choose one of these, what is your top priority as a practice? And if there is, you know, between increasing appointment volume, saving staff time, reducing administrative costs, all that stuff, what is the most important piece of the puzzle to you? Because again, I think what we found is that every practice seems to have a slightly different focus. All of them are, all of these things are important. Like, you couldn't have one without the other. But if one of these had to be your top priority, which one would it be? So we'll give some time here again for people to get their votes in. I know the survey is a little different from what's there. All right, another 5 seconds. Get your final votes in. 2, 1. All right, ending the poll.
How are we doing?
Super interesting. I mean, Chris, I'll let you talk about this first, since I talked about the last one first. But I mean, I feel like, yeah, you go first. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, if you read, I don't have the actual poll.
Oh, yeah. So we've got 56%, which is increasing appointment volume. We've got 21% saving staff time, reducing administrative costs, and 23% improving the patient experience. So it seems like the clear winner again here is increasing, that we have a clear winner here, increasing appointment volume. So yeah, I don't know, experience from what you've talked to practices about.
Yeah, it's I think that's a key aspect, especially we'll go over the case studies, especially during COVID, where appointment volume was naturally down, which is predictable. I think the key here is, what is the benchmark or appointment volume that the practice needs to keep to be profitable? And that sounds kind of crass, so to speak, but at the end of the day, practices are running a business, and I think if you increase appointment volume, you will more than likely save staff time by calling those patients through automation, and also get to see more patients and improve their health. So it's almost like a triple win. But I think I'm definitely not surprised by increasing appointment volume.
Yeah, and I think it's what's interesting to me is, believe it or not, there are some practices that I talk to that are not interested in appointment volume, because they're so focused on hiring more providers for their practice, that they already have too many patients to deal with. But I would say, by and large, that is not the trend in general. Usually it is around, hey, we need to increase our patient volume of appointments that are coming in. And I think there's what I would also say with that is, there are multiple avenues to go about that in terms of increasing appointment volume. Obviously, recovering lost patients is one piece of the puzzle, but then there's also other pieces of the puzzle of making sure that there's not slots that get unused at the right at the end, where it's we had somebody cancel 72 hours before their appointment and we weren't able to fill that with somebody else, or even just patient satisfaction surveys. All of those things are aspects of keeping the appointment volume high. But then going right along with that, of course, as you keep appointment volume high, the staff time is going to go up too. So how do you create more free time for staff to focus on the things that they really need to? And as all that goes on, making sure that the patient experience is there as well. Because if you don't, I mean, it's great, you're keeping your appointment volume high, but then if patient experience goes down, then all of a sudden your appointment volume goes down. So it's it's a symbiotic relationship. All of these things have to go together to make really a successful practice, I would say. Cool.
Yep.
All right, so our final piece of the puzzle here, understanding why reactivations work. So we'll get into some specifics on each one of these. Just as a high level, one thing that I'd mention again is that we've worked with different specialties, and what's very interesting to me is how different those are. So for example, I'll just give a high level example. We work with some orthopedics groups, and then we work with a lot of eye care groups. And what I would say is it's not a one size fits all, right? Because with a lot of eye care groups, you have patients who are coming in for annual appointments, and so you're going to recall them for that. Orthopedics, on the other hand, is they're not going to have necessarily an annual appointment to help with their broken arm, right? It just it doesn't they're not the same. And so a lot of these case studies have been, a lot of them actually are with more of those hey, we need to get this patient back in. But what's exciting is I think we're constantly learning more about the specialties that we work with of, hey, this eye practice had this issue, this other eye practice doesn't have that issue at all, which goes along again with what I was talking about, where it's, some practices need a higher appointment volume, some are trying to save staff time. So how can we combine both of those things into a workflow that's going to help in the long run? So with that being said, so first one, canceled no-show appointments. Yeah, you can go to the next slide there. So on that, the idea behind this, I think, goes back to, I think Chris was talking about it earlier, of there is going to be a balance of automation and manual effort in anything you do. If somebody tells you differently, they're trying to sell you something, right? Like you can never fully 100% automate everything that's being done. So at a high level, and I'll let Chris go into the actual case study of a group that we did with this, but at a high level, we have some groups that, I was actually just talking to a group the other week, and they were like, hey, we don't actually want to do like an automated no-show message the day after an appointment. One, because they want to give their patients a chance to do it on their own, without like having to get another automated message. And they also want a personal touch. So what we ended up agreeing on is, okay, we're going to send a message 2 days after a no-show appointment. And then what we'll do is we'll provide the list of patients who didn't schedule even after we sent that message. And then the staff calls a week later to all those patients who are left. So hopefully it's a smaller list. And by this, we're doing two things. One, we're taking the big chunk of the effort and hopefully automating that with automated messages, trying to get patients to schedule. And then patients who still haven't scheduled after 7 days, then the staff is calling them. And maybe then we do another automated outreach a month later. It can all tie together. So I think as we go through these case studies, understanding that there is a balance between automation and personal outreach. And the best practices that I've seen these case studies work for are the practices that understand that balance and have an aspect of both of those in that. So I'll stop jabbering here. I'll let you, Chris, get into the case study of the group that we did the no-show case study with.
Yeah, definitely. And I think this sort of reactivation is a no-brainer, because you're right. I think it does complement the manual effort as well, or at least it takes a chunk of, or frees up a chunk of time for practices. So if you imagine this case study, we looked at, this was for over 4 behavioral health practices, where we looked at, let's look at all patients that had a no-show status or a cancellation status in the past 24 hours, and then subtract any patient that has a future appointment of a certain type into the future as well. So maybe you would want to target certain appointment types more aggressively versus other appointment types. But keeping that list running on a daily basis, so you imagine the data mining is going on. So today, for example, we'll run a list of all patients that no-showed yesterday, load the patients in the VI, and then either create an email, text, or voice, depending on the patient preference. And I think that's important too, because there's a fine line between over reminding and under reminding. I think we all know what it's like to be spammed. But that's the key sweet spot here, is let's look at text and email together with a phone call as backup, for example. And what we found is, and I was really curious as to what are the results of these. How many patients are we actually recovering? Because it's one thing to message patients, but how do we know how well it's working? And I think what was cool is that 50% of targeted patients responded. So you imagine in a message, you could say, please press 0 to be connected to our office to reschedule now. Please reply Y. And then upon replying Y or confirming a message, we provide the phone number for the patients to call. And I think what was cool, just from automation alone, out of all the no-shows, 34% were recovered as a result of receiving a message. So you imagine that's, that's, I'm so bad at math, but 66% of patients remain in. So that's already a lot of time taken off having to manually recall patients. And then, of course, okay, so maybe we could go one step further. Let's look at all patients that received a message and didn't reschedule. Let's do a follow-up after that. And now we're seeing this trend of, maybe the patient will ignore the first message. So let's try again with a different type of message as well. So I think from this case study, we're learning new workflows, and it's very dependent on the practice. It's not a one size fits all. but I think we're learning the ideal sweet spot as to how soon after the no-show should we message the patient. Should it be immediately, or would the practice prefer to call the patient first and then let's automate the rest of the follow-up 3 days after that as well?
Yeah.
It's been quite compelling to see the results of this.
Yeah, I remember when we were first doing some of these campaigns, we're like, oh yeah, like, I mean, I think this was one of our very first ones, right? Like such low hanging fruit, patients who no show, let's reach out to them, try and get them back in. And then I think it was a practice. It was like, oh, like, can we reach out to those patients again if they didn't schedule? And so we're like, oh, that makes a ton of sense. And I think about it for myself, and it's like, if I get a text about like some action item that I'm supposed to do, I'm like, oh yeah, I got to do that. And then like oftentimes I instantly forget. And it's not because I don't like think I need to do that, or it's not that it's something that needs to be done. It's just I forget about it. And so oftentimes people like having those reminders. Of course, there's always the balance of like bothering patients too much. But I think what we found is like, hey, if we send that message and then we send a follow-up, 5 days later, a week later, or, a couple of follow-ups, a week later, 2 weeks later, patients actually appreciate that because it's helping to remind them that they need to take care of that, and it gives them the option right there in a message, in a phone call, to either connect to the office, to go to the website, whatever they need to do to take that next step to make the appointment. And the easier that you can make life for the patients, the more satisfied oftentimes that they're going to be, because it's like, oh, maybe they're my wife is telling me that I need to get an eye doctor appointment. I'm like, oh yeah, like I need to do that. But it's like, what do I like? What number do I call to do that? I've got to get a hold of them again. Like, it seems silly, but at the same time, when you make it easy for people, they're so much more likely to do it. And this is such low hanging fruit. If I no-showed an appointment, if you just send me a text to tell me, hey, no problem, here's the number so you can reschedule, I'm like, okay, great. I can do that quick. I can do that in like 5 minutes, hopefully. So making it easy for patients is huge.
Sure.
So on care protocol, I want to take a step back, because I know one of the big focuses of what we're talking about is like, oh, generate revenue for the practice, keep you alive. And that is obviously a huge focus. I think that's one of the biggest reasons why we started. But I think it's important to divide what we're talking about into 3 separate categories. It's all in the same boat, right? But 3 separate categories within the same boat. So what I mean by that is, this care protocol piece is focused on patients who have certain diagnosis or, certain procedures that they have, trying to make sure that they come back in. So I think the big thing that we're doing is we're hopefully helping to save practices time. So time that they used to be having to use for manual outreach, trying to get patients in, trying to make sure that they have the information for their appointment, all that kind of stuff. That's a lot of manual stuff that hopefully we're helping to solve there. So that's a big piece. The second piece is the actual revenue generating side. So these patients who may not have been in otherwise, once you get them in, think about how much each of those appointments is worth. If you have an appointment that's worth $100, and instead of somebody having to reach out or try and make that appointment happen, you have automated system that's getting those patients in, having those appointments happen, not to mention the continued value of that patient, then that's a huge amount of revenue generated for the practice. But I think those 2 are important. But maybe the most important of all is, and this is honestly why I'm working at a company that's working with healthcare groups, is we're helping patients get the care that they need. And that might, again, it might seem silly in some senses. It's like, oh, if you're an eye group, it's like it's eye care, but like, that's so important. Patients taking care of their eye health, or if you're, any specialty that's out there, those are such important needs for the patients. And so making sure that you are following up with those patients, and that goes along again here with getting really specific with, hey, if we can know exactly what kind of procedure they were billed for, we can get them the right specific message to get them back in, to get them continued care for the need that they have. So I just wanted to take a step back to talk about that. But within that, then, as we get into some of this care protocol, I think it's thinking through what are those needs. Maybe it's diabetic patients. Diabetic patients have to come in maybe more often than your standard patient. And so do we create a specific campaign for diabetic patients that has verbiage in there to make sure that they come back in for their follow-up appointment, or for glaucoma patients, or whatever it may be. So again, I'll let Chris get into the case study, but as we go through, I want us to continue to understand, it's not just helping you save time. It's not just generating revenue for your practice. We're truly hoping that you are caring for the long-term needs of your patients and trying to do that in an efficient and effective way.
Yeah, thanks for going over that. It's really helps sort of tee up this. One of my, I almost call this a hero's journey. This was with a practice in Arizona that wanted to try to recover from, increased patient volume, just from as a practice, recovered from COVID. Now the practice is fully operational. So we go in and say, right, what do you need? Here's our recommendations. So we defined a targeted list of patients, of all patients that haven't been seen in a year, for example. Quite simple. And that created a huge list, honestly. And this was a practice that averaged around 4,700 patients a month. And they just wanted to get the appointment volume back up to pre-COVID levels. So then we started looking at, okay, let's really dive into this and see how can we really help? And so we created this reactivation playbook where, again, looking at all patients that haven't been seen in a year, let's subtract any patient that has been seen. And then we look at the results of that. And it was great. We increased appointment volume, but then, let's take it another step further. Let's make another follow-up message for patients who receive the message but still haven't made an appointment, because that, as a result of the performance workflow, we can make tweaks and any adjustments and just go in and say, right, we need more results. And so after 3 months with the initial message going out and then plus a follow-up message, what we've seen was we got the 55% response rate, which is very similar to the no-show. We're finding patients do interact with messages and do appreciate being reminded, maybe through all the hulu baloo of COVID and everything else, it's, let's let the patient know that, the practice is open and ready to be seen. And so what we found over 3 months, and this is crazy, 17% appointment volume increase. So we went from 4,700 up to 5,900 appointments on average per month, which is amazing. And I think this really inspired us to create new playbooks and things like that. But it was really cool to see just that such sharp rise in appointment volume increase just by a simple playbook, list creation, and outreach to the patient.
Yeah, I think you mentioned the word playbook. I think that's what's been cool to me is as we've worked, I mentioned this like ad nauseum now, but like working with different specialties, we're able to basically figure out, hey, with eye groups, this tends to be a very successful like campaign or groups of campaigns, doing a no-show, doing an annual reactivation, doing it based off of this CPT code. And we're able to kind of build that playbook. And then when we talk to practices, of course, every practice is different, but we can say, hey, like this is what we've seen work really well. And if you do this, this is what we can estimate you're going to see on a return, either in appointment volume or in just like patients no-showing and coming back into the office. And so I think that's what's been cool is being able to create some of these different playbooks within specialties that we can then help practices with, instead of having to start from scratch every time where it's like, we have no clue what to do. It's like, well, here's something to start with. So I think that's been a cool part of what we've done.
Yeah, and most of our playbooks and ideas come from the practices themselves. Honestly, we can't take all credit to it.
Oh yeah, oh yeah.
Nice to work with like-minded people.
Yeah. So I'll be quick here, but I was actually just talking to a guy who is really, really focused on like patient reviews and such. And as we were talking and digging into some of the data around patient retention, one of the like most shocking things that I saw, it makes a lot of sense, but basically the stat is that acquiring a new patient for a practice costs anywhere from 5 all the way up to 25 times as much as just retaining a current patient. Wow. So this goes back to our very first premise of like recovering lost patients. If we have a way to recover patients that are already patients at our practice, that's so much cheaper than the efforts of like marketing outreach, trying to get new patients in the door, the intake process, the forms that have to be done with that. So it's so much cheaper for practices to maintain patients. as well as what we were talking about, like continuing their care. We want to, we want to create an environment within the practices that we work with of hey, we have the patients that we have. Let's take care of those patients. Let's be in it for the long haul with them. And I think I was thinking of it even from my role. So my role as an account manager at Vital Interaction is basically this. It's like my job is to retain our customers that we have. And so this is, again, a symbiotic relationship. The more that I help our customers to be successful and get the things that they need, that's going to help me because they're going to be happy and they're going to get what they need where they are. And it's also going to help them because they are, they're not having to do all the tasks that they used to have to do. And so this goes, what my job is with our customers is the same thing that our customers then have to do with the patients that they work with. It's making sure that those patients are remaining happy, that you're reaching out to them when you need to, so that they stay and you don't have to go out and get a bunch of new patients. So, and this is my favorite case study. So I'll let you go into the case study here, Chris.
Yeah, this was also because I wanted to go through a specific average practice workflow. So we've talked about the smart list engine and reactivations, but recalls, right? But a lot of IK groups or any practice, let's say a patient has their annual well check, they check out of the front office, the practice puts the recall into the system, we would integrate with it and send a message. And recalls are recalls, and I think they're an important part of any practice. It's important. And recalls are almost a reactivation because it's setting a reminder in the system to notify the patient that they're due in a year. But just adding those alone, we're seeing, increased in appointment volume since going live. So we see here just the more recalls load in, the more messages are sent, the more the appointment volume here is at the top. But then we thought to ourselves, what if a recall was not entered into the practice? How do we create that safety net for our customers? So then we looked at what we mentioned before is the annual reactivation. So we looked at all patients that had an appointment a year ago, does not have an appointment scheduled since or in the future, and does not have a recall entered. So that's really your kind of safety net, so to speak. And as soon as upon adding that, it created just 44,000, or from 39 to 44,000. That's very much what we've mentioned before is low hanging fruit. But then, then we thought, well, let's look at our messages. How do the messages look? How do the messages sound from the providers themselves? So we had this sort of great idea from a customer of ours, and I thought initially, God, that could be difficult, but you know what? It could be done. So we had the providers sign up to record the message themselves. So, and with the phone masking on top of it. So you imagine, instead of receiving a call from a random number, this call is coming from the practice. And then once you answer the call, it's the actual provider talking on the message. And we found that patients were 3 times more likely to pick up the phone if it's from the practice and with the provider talking over the actual message as well. And I thought, it seems like a simple idea at first, but it's just brilliant. And I think it should be standard practice for a lot of practices. And so from there, what we see with the annual, the recalls and the provider recalls added, we went from all the way at the beginning to 81,000 appointments per month to 104. And that's just a 28% increase just by adding that personalization. So I think what we're now working on is how can we take personalization to the next level? Can we embed videos and messages? How do we make it easier for providers to record their own messages and add that to the smart list engine to improve patient retention and volume?
Yeah. And I think what's cool here is this is what's propelled so much on the product side at Vital Interaction. You mentioned like hearing from the practice, what that one practice about wanting to do like the provider recorded messages. It was like, oh, it's difficult at first, but now it's propelled a whole new wave of personalized communication and realizing how efficient that is, not only on reactivations, but then we have other stuff that we've been doing with pre-appointment messages, with recording providers and putting a video in the email, so this has propelled so much of it. And so seeing how you can learn, you can change just slight little things where, oh, instead of it, the staff recording the message, it's the provider recording the message. Wow, so much more beneficial there, right? So we have a last poll to do. So I will send the poll out and automating communication. So so this one is just around, again, we've talked about every practice is different. So for you specifically at your practice, what would be the number one thing that you wish that you could automate? So I'll give some time here for everyone to answer the poll there. It might be kind of difficult because you can only choose one. I made the option so you can only choose one. So, but if you could only choose one, what would be the one that you would automate there? So I'll give 20 seconds or so here for people to answer it. Another 10 seconds or so. Lots of votes going in. Seems like there's a definite trend once again. I guess I didn't mention this, but yeah, if you do have something other that you're like, oh, well, it'll actually be this, you can definitely put that in the chat if you would like. All right, 5 seconds here. Get your votes in now. All right, ending the poll. So, I mean, again, our results are clear. So rescheduling patients who no show or cancel is our highest trend there. So I think, I mean, it makes a lot of sense. And it's also what Chris and I mean, that's what we started with. Like the very first campaigns that we started running were around patients who were no showing or cancel. Because one, it's very low hanging fruit of patient to reach out to those patients. But two, it's also just like a very time consuming task, like to have to reach out to a patient that no showed or canceled, and you don't know why they necessarily did. And then you're leaving a voicemail because nobody answers the phone anymore. So it's very low hanging fruit. And I think that it's beneficial. And I think with all of this, another thing to mention is a lot of these things are beneficial, whether you're a 150 provider practice or whether you're a 1 or 2 provider practice, right? Like the staff time, whether it's 10 staff members doing that or 1 staff member doing that, is going to be proportionate to the practice, right? So, hey, if you're like a single provider practice and you just, you don't have time to reach out to those patients that no showed, or, oh, I have to do that at the end of my day every day, or the canceled appointments. What if instead you could automate that and then dedicate that time to something else at the practice? So I think it's important to note, as we've gone through these case studies, we've worked with really small practices and really large practices, and the automation is there and is helpful, I think, regardless of the size of the practice.
Yeah, and I'll second that too. I think, truth be told, it becomes even more important for the smaller practices that really just want to focus on patients as well. I think just the administrative burden can be quite high there.
Yeah, for sure. All right, so the Q&A chat is open. We're coming upon the end. Very much appreciate the participation in the polls. Honestly, that's helpful for us, I think, even just in understanding, as we've said, many ideas have come from the practices that we work with, so it's helpful to understand the trends. But if you have questions from the presentation, please feel free to put it in the chat now, and or in the Q&A, either one, and we'll get to those questions as we go. So let me look here. I think I've got a few questions coming in. Let me look at them. All right. There's one. Okay, so here's one, Chris. You can probably speak better to this than I can, but can you provide an example of what a provider recorded recall would look like? I don't know if we have like a visual, but we could at least like walk through, I think, probably of what that would look like.
Yeah, so first we work with the practice to have a script by provider. So, and then we essentially provide directions to the provider to record that message. And then we'll embed that voice call and associate it to the provider that has that recall. So for example, let's create a list of all patients that saw that provider a year ago, has not come back since. And then we have that list. And then as soon as the provider records the message, we just have a shared drive. And then we'll embed that message in the actual phone call. And it goes with voice call as well as human live voice as well. But we'd be happy to provide certain examples as well.
Yeah, great question. I think it can be a little